put a spell on you. Cause you're mine.
Hi, my name is Yomaira Figueroa.
My name is Jessica Marie Johnson.
And this is Electric Marronage. Electric Marronage is a collaborative digital material project based on principles of fugitivity, Black femme freedom, worlds otherwise, and decolonizing diaspora studies. It is curated by myself and by Jessica Marie Johnson. And today we are recording the second podcast in our Spring 2020 Taller. I am here today with
Tamara Butler,
Randy Gill Sadler,
Jada Similton,
and Kelsey Moore.
Awesome. So with us today is Dr. Randy Gill Sadler from Lafayette College. Dr. Gill Sadler is assistant professor of English and Black feminist literature. Her forthcoming book manuscript, Diasporic Dissonance, Black Women's Writing, the Caribbean and U.S. Empire, asserts that Black women writers use the Caribbean to explore Black diasporic antagonisms resulting from U.S. imperial exploits. As part of her visit here, she did the graduate workshop, Caution Empire and Black Feminist Literature, and today she's going to be presenting a public talk titled Conjuring Cartography, Black Placemaking in the Cold War in Gloria Naylor's Mama Day. Thank you, Randy. So, Jessica, you want to get us started?
Yeah, so thank you, Randy, for being here with us and for entering the taller and talking marronage and fugitivity with us. The first question that is on all of our minds, of course, is the rule you picked. You picked rule 4, whatever, sort of asterisk whatever, and I was wondering why you picked that rule, what that means to you, how that fits into thinking about fugitivity and marronage and into your work. So please tell us more.
Yeah, thank you for the question, and also thank you for having me. When I got the rules, the whatever rule stood out to me because it also included questions of pocket contents, politics, imaginaries, and paths. And as I was thinking about how I wanted to enter into a conversation about Mama Day, Gloria Naylor's work, and Black feminist literature writ large, the geographic imaginaries that Black women were thinking through, the imaginative solidarities that they were posturing in their work, and also just speculation, right, as a mode of intellectual work, political work to kind of think beyond imperial modes of existing in the world. And so I thought whatever would be a good place to kind of situate those thoughts and include Mama Day into that kind of conversation.
So you mentioned Mama Day. So I wanted to ask you about the novel because in Willow Springs, Willow Springs is not a part of South Carolina or Georgia. That's not a part of the U.S. nation state. So can you talk more about how Naylor is maybe cautioning African Americans against this inclusion into the U.S. project?
Oh, yes, thank you. I definitely think that is a big part of what Naylor is doing. But I also think that she's kind of communicating other types of colonial relationality, right? I think that kind of not included but part of is part of a longer history of like U.S. imperial language, right? When we think about 19th century descriptions of what Puerto Rico would be, what the Philippines would be, right? There was this kind of language or discourse that emerged to say that this belongs to us, but it's not part of us, right? And I think that what Naylor is doing is really kind of taking that discourse and really kind of deconstructing it, right, to kind of imagine this place that was, once a plantation, once a slave state, that now all the Black people have been deeded this land and they have that kind of right to ownership. But that connection, I definitely think she's trying to ask us to think outside of the nation state as a model, right? Also, but to understand the ways in which that particular political reality still shapes our autonomous spaces, but definitely asking us to think beyond that kind of geographic conception, but also think outside of that scale of knowledge production, to really think about the island and the archipelago as ways to kind of approach knowledge and create knowledge outside of the nation state.
Thank you so much.
No, but I wanted to quickly pick up on this question of like how you phrase this, like you belong to us, but you're not part of us.
Yes.
As a way of U.S. thinking about its empire, its commonwealth, its whatever,
Yes.
right? These kind of accessories, its showcases in the Pacific and in the Caribbean.
Yes.
But also the way that it treats Black people.
Absolutely.
Right? Like, and so we have the kind of model of internal colonialism.
Absolutely.
And understanding of the ways that Black people, especially Black women, are situated within this larger empire.
Yes.
That is not just expanding outwards, but actually absolutely controlling inward.
Absolutely.
Yeah. No, one of the things that I think we talked about a little bit, and I'll be interested to hear more from you about this, is this kind of idea that Black women map out islands for us. And so the kind of pathways that Naylor makes available to us and how they may connect, which is something that we talked about a little bit, the Caribbean to other like kind of U.S. spaces. So I didn't know if you wanted to think a little bit more around this kind of like Caribbean islands, sea islands, and imagined islands.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, so I think for me, what I see kind of happening, particularly in the 1980s with Black women's literature, is this search for an outside of the United States, and not in a way that kind of gets away from certain types of marginalization and oppression, but also in a way that's really reckoning with connections between a kind of transnational imperial project and an internal colonial project, right? And so to your point, Black women writers are kind of traversing various archipelagos, from the Sea Islands with Gloria Naylor and Paula Marshall, to real places like the Bahamas and Grenada, where they're coming and reporting on U.S. imperial exploits, but then also imagining fictional places like a Willow Springs or Paula Marshall's A Chosen Place of Timeless People, where she imagines the kind of West Indian island of Bourne Hills, right? And I think this is particularly important because I think there are certain conversations with the way kind of neoliberalism is happening in the United States, and the ways in which there are discourses emerging that are saying certain problems around racism, sexism, and imperialism are no longer an issue, right? I think Black women's work takes us to this kind of outside space to not only reveal that these problems are still an issue, but that these problems create this kind of diasporic Black anti-colonial community that is really kind of inaugurated and maintained through Black women's literary production. So, yeah.
Thank you.
And that makes me think a lot about what we did yesterday in the workshop. Yesterday for the Electric Marinage Tayed, we had the grad student workshop where you showed us two pieces of archival sources that you pulled from Essence Magazine.
Yes.
From the early 1980s. Do you want to
Yes.
talk to us a little bit about that?
Yes. So I brought in a tourism advertisement for Bermuda that was featured pretty regularly throughout the 80s in Essence Magazine. It was part of a larger discourse on Caribbean tourism that includes the It's Better in the Bahamas advertisements as well. Those were frequently produced in Essence Magazine. And I brought that in with a short piece by June Jordan called Black People and Foreign Policy. And what I was trying to do in bringing those together is kind of highlight the kind of contradictory politics that are inherent to kind of Black women's literature in the 80s, right? On the one hand, there is this appeal to a kind of middle-class bourgeois cosmopolitanism, but then there are also radical Black feminists like June Jordan who are really kind of cautioning against that mode of engaging the world, who are cautioning us to think beyond, thinking about the world and the Caribbean specifically as a playground, right? And I'm just really fascinated by the fact that both of these pieces can appear in a space like Essence, and what that kind of tells us about the kind of politics that Black women are having to navigate through various literary publics, right, and publications. So.
I mean, this is really fascinating. I mean, there are so many ways that the work that you're doing really kind of brings in this constellation of Black women writers in particular. And it reminds me or makes me think of the ways that Black women's writing has always been engaged in a kind of radical imagining of the future or radical imagining of other possibilities.
Yes.
Even in some of the like tensions and complexities of how do you get out of U.S.
Yes.
empire? How do you get
Yes.
out of imperialism? And like the range of stories of reimaginings that you're working with across the different authors. Like, is there a way that how do you hold the complexity of that, especially as a scholar engaging in that and as somebody who's trying to think with this radical thought? Because you have some writers who are thinking about, whole new fantastic places. You have
Yes.
some writers who really are drawing on history. Like, there were moments just immediately after the Civil War where former slaves, free people, like, they got land for
Yes.
a moment, for a brief moment, and then it was taken away from them.
Yes.
And so there are ways that some of the, like thinking of Mama Day, like there are ways that some of these spaces that seem so fantastical to us, to them then in the 20th century, and then to us now even, were very real possibilities.
Yes.
But then you also have, like you were saying, the June Jordan piece that was really troubling some of the aspirations of a kind of Black middle class, or
Yes.
feminine class, or meritocracy. So are there ways that you like hold things constant, or do you like just also kind of love the whatever of the array of the different possibilities? Both seem really powerful praxis, So.
I try to do a little bit of both, right? And I think part of it too is to first kind of acknowledge the fact that Black women are working through these issues as they're happening, right? So Audre Lorde goes to Grenada, I think it's like 6 weeks after the invasion, right? So they're kind of on the ground doing this literary activism, what we might call literary activism, and also to kind of understand that urgency and the kind of dire political and economic situation that they're working in, and how they're kind of theorizing in that moment is not always the kind of, codified, neat kind of theory that we're used to. But I think the moment is calling for a different form of communication, a different kind of communication. So I sit in the whatever of that, right? And to me, that whatever looks like various engagements with literary forms, right? June Jordan and Audre Lorde kind of utilized the report, right, as a form in which to address the kind of immediate problems of U.S. empire. June Jordan is also using poetics. Paula Marshall does the novel. So I think the whatever comes in Black women's kind of play with form and what literary form can actually demonstrate, right, the kind of decolonial solidarities and politics that they're trying to put forth. Another way that I kind of hold this tension is, I think in terms of Black diaspora studies, which is a project I'm trying to be in conversation with, I think we're seeing more work that's encouraging us to sit with antagonisms and tensions, right? So whether that's, Brent Hayes Edwards' work or Nadia Ellis's work that I'm really inspired by, I think in terms of methodology, they're suggesting that there's something to be learned from, right? Failure, antagonism, messiness, whatever. And I'm trying to sit with that and work in that and hope that I can get my book out too, like them. So, yeah.
So I was actually, the name of your talk today is Conjuring Cartography. So I was actually hoping to bring in these conversations of conjuring that we see in Mama Day and perhaps give us a glimpse of what you're going to talk about in your talk.
Yes.
So we know that Willow Springs is at a crossroads between South Carolina and Georgia, which is an important, being at the crossroads is an important positionality in conjure work. So I was wondering if you could talk about this sort of conjuring as you see it, and then how it relates to your project on empire, and also how it relates to conjure as a dual practice of harming and healing, and how that can lead to certain forms of resistance.
Yes. Thank you for the question. The first part in terms of, I guess you were asking about the crossroads and how I see kind of conjure and cartographies. And I'll get into a little bit of this in terms of the talk, but when Gloria Naylor is writing Mama Day and she's trying to explain in an interview, I think it's in 1988, what she's trying to do, and she basically says, like, I needed another landscape, right? I needed another space to tell the story and ask the questions that I'm trying to ask. And part of what I'll be talking about in the talk is this kind of transnational research trip that she goes on that starts in Robinsonville, Mississippi, that then takes her to Charleston, South Carolina, and takes her to Mexico, brings her back to the Sea Islands, right? And along that way, she's kind of collecting narratives and histories of conjuring, healing from Black women, right? And so Black women kind of function as the kind of conditions of possibility for this work to actually emerge, right? And so to me, in terms of kind of thinking about conjuring, I'm thinking about it particularly for this talk with the kind of creation of space through Afro-descendant knowledge practices, as well as thinking about Black women as producers of space, not always objects being emplaced or placed in other spaces. So that's kind of how I'm thinking about that. And in terms of conjuring as harming and healing, I mean, we see that in the novel, right? That was such a reading about Coco and what she's going through when she's, quote unquote, hexed was like devastating, right? Yeah. The imagery that Naylor gives us around her experience and what's happening to her body. But I also think in terms of, again, how we kind of treat Black women's knowledge production in these practices, I think what's useful is about what Naylor is doing is to suggest that these conjured spaces are not utopic. They are not without their own intra-communal tensions, beefs, right? Beef between people who are both, conjure women, right. Beef between people who are practicing Christianity and conjuring.
Greatest beef of all time.
Right. So, and again, like thinking about Jessica's question earlier, I think those tensions are productive because I think in a larger context of the 1980s, right, one way we can think about what's happening in the Cold War is a contest over what knowledge will emerge, right? What knowledge practices, what truths, what histories will actually emerge in the public and kind of be accepted and legitimized in particular ways. And so I think the tensions around conjuring, what can it do, how does it work, help us to think about that kind of larger landscape of what knowledge is meant to do in a moment of kind of imperial expansion. Right? So
nice. So I guess my question is to you, what does a decolonial Black world or cartography look like to you?
Oh, man. Okay. Oh, goodness. That's a really great question. So I think part of it has to be about a dissolution of boundaries first. So I think, these questions around nation state, boundaries, walls, etc., right? I think that's part of deconstructing those, destroying those has to be part of a decolonial Black feminist cartography. But I also think in terms of the types of spaces that we privilege, that cartography looks different, right? Black women's relationship, not just to landscapes, but to water, to soil, to sand, to these very particular material elements of the world will look different on that map, especially when you're coming from a position that's not looking to dispossess and expropriate, but that's actually kind of engaging in a more kind of communal and politics of sharing with those landscapes and seeing those landscapes as bodies of knowledge in and of themselves. So I would start with that, but then I would need to think more deeply about what that cartography would look like. But that's a wonderful question.
Thank you.
I think I'm gonna ask the question that every Mama Day reader wants to know. Okay. And if we could talk to Gloria Naylor, we would probably ask the specific question. Yes. What is 18 and 23? What are your speculations about it? And does it relate at all to your project on Black women in empire? Or is it something different entirely?
Okay. So I'm going to do that thing that I think like professors do where they don't flip the question, but they're like, oh, we're not supposed to know this. Because I really do think I don't think we're supposed to have a definitive definition of what that is. I think she gives us points of reference Right, so we know like 1823, like this is the year, right, that Safira Wade is able to get the land deeded to her and her descendants. We don't really know the process by which she does that, right? It's speculation, right? Did she poison them? Did she trick them? How did this happen, right? And so I think for me, when I read it, right, I think it's supposed to kind of index that particular moment, but also to kind of suggest a certain kind of conjuring magic and speculation around what that moment and also too, right, the afterlife of that moment. Right? What did it mean for Safira Wade to be able to get that land, right, in a way that we don't know about? But also, what does that suggest about some of the kind of hidden tactics, hidden practices that kind of develop in slavery that are also part of the afterlife of slavery, right? So not just that kind of oppression that comes, right, but those resistance strategies and tactics that we carry with us, sometimes not even knowing, but in a place like Willow Springs that's kind of shrouded in mystery and magic that are part of the landscape, part of the geography. So that's what I think. I don't think we're supposed to know, but I think it's supposed to harken back to, resistance strategies that kind of point to both like possibilities for liberation and oppression within the context of slavery, if I had to say. But I won't be talking about that in my paper, so I'm glad you got that out the way now.
It's good to avoid it. I would avoid it.
It's such a difficult question.
Thing to pin down. Like, it's hard to pin down.
And I think in terms of the novel, not only does she give us multiple meanings it could have, we also get examples of how it's interpreted wrong.
Yeah.
right, with Rima's boy, right? So I definitely think it's supposed to kind of point to, kind of non-Western practices around, like, conjuring, politics, decoloniality, but that's not supposed to be able to be pinned down.
Right.
In a particular way.
Well, in a way that speaks back to questions of opacity that we were talking about yesterday,
about
right? Thinking about both the politics of refusal, right? Not having or not being able to know everything about Black subjectivity.
Absolutely.
Especially Black women's subjectivity,
Absolutely.
right? Like, how do you keep, like, this fugitive subjectivity, right?
Absolutely.
If you are always already transparent. So
Absolutely.
Glissant's kind of concept of opacity becomes so important here, but also the way that gets lived out in women's lives. And I think Jessica's book Wicked Flesh takes that up in a really beautiful way, which it's coming out in August. Woo-woo.
So just to take it back to like questions about imperialism and African Americans' roles in this.
Yes.
So in the grad workshop, you talk a lot about African American exceptionalism. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what African American exceptionalism is for our listeners and how it relates to your work.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So to me, African American exceptionalism is a way to kind of describe the ways in which African American experiences, subjectivities, and freedom struggles come to sometimes problematically stand in for or become the index for all Black people's experiences, right? That we measure progress, whether that's politically, culturally, or economically, by what's happening with African Americans, right? And this becomes a problem because we oftentimes don't talk about what does African American kind of progress mean when African Americans have such a close proximity to empire, right? Just by lived experience, just by the ways empire kind of invites African American participation via, military, political positions, and also literature, right? And so for me, part of what my work is about and the way my work is engaging with African American exceptionalism is to really think about the Black women's literary renaissance in a transnational way that acknowledges that so many of the women writers from that period were not only of Caribbean heritage, but were looking to the Caribbean to destabilize some of the problematic ways that African Americans are being propped up as markers of the fact that the United States has moved past Jim Crow or moved past anti-Blackness, right? And that becomes particularly problematic in the 80s, where the United States is kind of celebrating Black women, Black women's literature, and Black people in particular ways in the United States, while invading Black countries like Grenada, while setting up multinational tourism companies in the Bahamas, right? And I think, so my work is really trying to reckon with the fact that at the very moment that we see Black women's literary works gaining critical acclaim, both in kind of mainstream literary institutions and in some ways in the university, you know, this is also a moment where Black women diasporically are in very precarious positions because of U.S. imperial expansion across the hemisphere, right? And so I think my work is really trying to ask people to think outside of a kind of African American exceptionalism. Sometimes we often don't even know that's the way in which we're thinking, because I think some imperialism does a very good job of concealing itself, concealing its logics. And so my project is really trying to ask us to think about Black people's relationship to empire in a more diasporic and transnational way. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think thinking a little bit about the kind of workshop that happened yesterday, the Taye, and thinking about one of the things that you emphasized was caution, and how Black women writers were cautioning and offering us like different language, especially in the 80s. And so I guess the question is, like, what do you see as maybe like Naylor's caution in Mama Day? What is she trying to get us to see and think about?
I think Naylor's caution is really about, or we get her caution particularly in the character of George. I would argue, right? Because it's this kind of quintessential pull yourself up by your bootstrap story, right? We have this young Black child who's kind of orphaned and grows up in a group home and gets a lot of kind of order and discipline, right? And ultimately goes to college, becomes an engineer. He's reading Shakespeare's King Lear, like doing all of these kind of, participating in all these kind of Western regulatory schemas, right? And so I think it's that kind of tension between him and Coco, but also kind of like him and Mama Day, right? Once Coco is in danger, what is the knowledge or intellectual tradition that's going to save her? Right? So George kind of comes on the island. He's being polite. Like, you know, he's like, okay, y'all bugging out a little bit. I don't believe in this, but I'm going along with it, right? But then, you know, once the hurricane happens and Coco gets sick, he immediately kind of he wants to get back to the mainland. I have to get Coco to a real hospital with real medicine, right? And we see Mama Day kind of go to the other place, right? Which I'll talk about a little bit in my talk about kind of being this alternative site of knowledge production, right? That is rooted in a kind of past of slavery, but also looking towards this kind of future of Black freedom. And I think she's kind of warning us, I think, about a certain investment in that, you know, rigid discipline and disciplinary way of thinking, right? The fact that he's an engineer to me is like not lost on me. It's like that. It's also like that privileging of STEM that's also going on in the contemporary moment. He's also a Republican. All right. So, you know, for the Black people supporting Bloomberg. Can I say that? Take that off. Don't say that. Keep it. Right? So in that way, right, I think that the novel is really kind of cautioning us against that kind of emergence, like that kind of Black subjectivity that is so embedded in the nation state and these kind of Western regulatory schemas of knowledge production. And so I think, you know, the tension around that is really definitely a caution for us. I mean, I think it's also a caution against a certain kind of forgetting and an abandoning of, you know, for all us Southern girls, like our traditions and the practices that sustain us and the places that sustain us, right? And so I think, again, in a moment where we think about the 80s and we see the kind of tokenistic picking of certain Black people to kind of stand in for a narrative of Black progress. I think Gloria Naylor is suggesting that there's something wrong with that, and that knowledge doesn't always hold, right, or do the kind of liberatory work that it's proposed to be doing. Yeah.
I wanted to say something because there's something really incredible happening in this room, and I think also with our electricians on Zoom, it's like I'm sitting in a room with these Southern Black women, right? All three. Rep your state.
South Carolina.
North Carolina.
Alabama.
And Kelsey, where you from?
South Carolina.
Oh. Yeah. Now, Jessica and I are kind of northern southern girls in that, New York, New Jersey, and Chicago, but also Puerto Rico. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like, we like Caribbean South.
Yeah,
but there is something else going on here. And I wanna like prompt y'all to think about that locus of enunciation, right? And how does that inform your works? And I think all of you. I would love to hear from all of you. I know we got Ramsey on the hot spot, but
I know. Let's spread the heat a little bit here.
I need to piggyback off of Dr. Butler. So you say something, and then I can think.
I mean, I think being a Southerner, it informs my work because I realize just exactly what Randy is talking about in terms of not forgetting.
Yes.
And so my project is really rooted in going and talking to Black women who live on Johns Island. And so I was really excited when you brought up that Gloria Naylor went to Charleston and kind of like how the peninsula is centered and then the islands that surround it kind of fall a little bit down below the surface. And so it's trying to think about a new map that these women have drawn up that may not show up, as we talked about, in the archives. They're Black women who walked the island, who worked on the island, who lived there. And so for me, I think that's really been key in my work, is trying to get us to think about Black women writers have always seen the island.
Yes.
And so it's how do we start to bring that up, that there's something key in remembering, and there's something key about what they know.
Absolutely.
The South means so much to me, and I didn't realize it until late into my in my undergraduate career, because I did Africana studies. So I was traveling all over the diaspora, meeting all types of people, but I really didn't have much to say for myself and what being from South Carolina meant to me. So in my current project now, I'm just trying to just understand alternative ways that Black South Carolinians have come to know the world. And so, and I hope to in the future to connect it, go back to being more diaspora, more transnational, to find these connections. But right now, it's just an exploration of self. So yeah.
Right. My story is similar to Kelsey's in that being in the South, I didn't really realize my positionality. I mean, I went to an HBCU in Mississippi, so it was just the South is the South. But then I came to Michigan, and I was like, I would rather be in the South sometimes. And I'm like, okay, I have a new appreciation for that space since I'm now in this other space. And I'm also taking conjure feminisms with a Southern professor also. And it's teaching me to value those ways of knowing that my grandmother has, that I think now has become a source of pride, where at first it was just something that was. But then now, as I am talking about conjure, and my really Christian grandma who still puts red pepper around her house and does all of these things that are definitely conjure, but she will not say that. And so I'm having this new appreciation for the practices that I was raised around that I never thought much about. And now I am realizing that that is actually a source of meaning, and that things I can write about and I can talk about and sort of transform the discourse around knowledge production in general. So, it's a growing pride.
So I'm from North Carolina, and I didn't live outside of the South until I got my job at Lafayette College. So I grew up in North Carolina, went to undergrad in North Carolina, did my PhD at the University of Florida, and even there was participating in the oral history project that was taking me to various places to interview Black elders throughout the South. So the South has really kind of just been my primary lens of just kind of seeing the world and understanding how the world works. But I also, the more I've learned and just the more I've read, just really kind of understanding the South as a locus for just radical politics, radical ways of thinking, radical ways of producing knowledge. Nina Simone's birthday was like a week ago from North Carolina, right? One of North Carolina's finest, right? If we read Assata Shakur's autobiography, she spends a lot of time growing up in North Carolina. Her people were from North Carolina, right? So to kind of think about this landscape as a place that is both a radical space, but also radicalizing, right? Various Black women in terms of political thought and aesthetics. So a lot of it is just, I think, a return, right? Thinking about the things that, our mother said, certain things about, don't put your purse on the floor, you're going to be broke.
Right. I feel like I stay saying that here, okay?
For sure.
But in Spanish, I'm like, no ponga la cartera en el piso, ¿qué tú haces?
My mom had things about, you don't sweep a broom over people's feet,
Yes,
right?
you gotta spit on the broom and do the hex.
Yes, and so many, just that being a part of who you are, but also kind of recognizing, right, the South as a perspective, as an analytic, thinking about the Great Migration. Those people brought the South with them. They brought the South to Harlem, to Chicago, to the West Coast, and just really kind of thinking about that as a tradition, as a way of knowing, and as a way of being real about what the world is, right, and being real about. I'm like, can I curse? Are we live? No.
No. You can curse. There was a whole lot of cursing when we did that first one. Yes.
But just a kind of understanding about how fucked up the world really is, right? But I think in terms of being from the South, I mean, you know that, you learn that at a very young age, and you also learn how to navigate and live and thrive in that, right? Nikki Giovanni has this poem where she's like, oh, people always talk to Black people and think that their childhood was the worst thing ever, right? And she's somebody who's coming from Tennessee, right? Another Southerner, and saying, no, that was not my experience. It wasn't pathological. It wasn't impoverished. I think, just the South just brings some other stuff about you.
Flavor.
I mean, it made me think about, and I think this is like something that I started thinking about recently, and it's really about hurricanes and our connection to water.
Yes.
And so it didn't really occur to me, like, when I was in 1989, right, if we're talking about the 80s, 1989, Hugo comes to Charleston.
Yep.
But what I've learned in kind of teaching and talking about Puerto Rico and teaching and talking about Audre Lorde is that it took that path, right? It takes a path through St. Croix.
It did.
It takes a path through Puerto Rico. It comes to Charleston.
Came through Charlotte, too.
Right?
Yep.
And so just kind of like that kind of thing in terms of we're still connected. So you have like the destruction of hurricanes, but you also have that we're tied by this history of like moving water, of wind, and that's something that's been brewing in my mind and then reminding me that a hurricane is what comes through Willow Springs.
Absolutely.
Right? So that, and then also like I feel like hurricanes have always been a part of my life. So I went to undergrad in New Orleans. Katrina comes through, and so it's like the same kind of really trying to figure out how do you take seriously our connection of like thinking about the South and global South and Black islands and just that kind of conception has really been shaped over the years. And the other thing that I don't know where to even put this, but I know as a kid, so many people in Charleston said Puerto Rican. And so anybody who was brown and spoke Spanish was Puerto Rican, not Mexican.
In Alabama, it was just Mexican.
I was like, how do you even know? So as a result of that, I had this like interesting like obsession and curiosity about Puerto Rico as a country. And eventually my mother worked for a Migrant Head Start, and there was a woman there who was from Puerto Rico. And I remember her gifting me a calendar as a kid. And I ripped all the pages out and put them up on my wall. And then to like finally get the opportunity to go was like, oh snap. I've been like,
yeah.
You know, to think about like conjure and think about like manifestation.
Yes.
Absolutely.
And but then when we went to Puerto Rico after the hurricane, when we went to Puerto Rico after the hurricane, and many times you've come with us, like Tamara's part of our Puerto Rico crew, but so many people that we met, like we were like, oh, Tamara es de Carolina del Sur, and they'd be like, oh, Carolina del Sur, and everybody had like this thing about like how they had been there or they were in the military there, and they were like so the connection with Tamara, even though she didn't speak Spanish at the time, she speaks a little bit now, bacalao. Oh yeah, jamón, you know, whatever. There was this instant connection in that way. And I wanted to say, building on the question of hurricane, is that like in Puerto Rico, like hurricane or huracán is part of the indigenous cosmology, right? Like these weather phenomena were part of the cosmology of the people, the way that they knew their world and their place in the world. And I think the more we distance ourselves from that, the more unnatural it seems. And I think what we see in the conversations around hurricanes is that folks who have had to endure and live through these particular kinds of weather patterns are able to come up with ways to survive them, right? And to understand them. And one of the things that was happening in Puerto Rico after the hurricane was that there was not enough children's books. So there was a lot of that depicted like actual life on this island. And so a lot of the kids were like, is this the first hurricane? Do people survive this? Like, are we ever going to get past this? And they were like, oh, no, we have a long history of surviving hurricanes. We need to produce books that show that because the kids need to know, like, you're not the first one to experience this, right?
Absolutely.
So, and I think this is, Mama Day also does that, right? Like, this becomes this important backdrop, right?
And it's also, too, it in addition to the kind of material experiences of hurricanes that kind of unite the South, the Caribbean, and the global South, Gloria Naylor, you know, talks about the fact that part of the reason a hurricane emerges in this work is also as an ode to or connection to Zora Neale Hurston's Our Eyes Were Watching God, right? She's inspired by that and says, like, I wanted to render, right, that hurricane in a novel in a way that was similar to what Zora Neale Hurston does. And I think, again, there's a certain kind of attention to the elements and to the events that really shape Black people's lives throughout the South and global South that we see in Black women's writing, right? And Black women's cultural production. Think about blues women who are talking about floods, right, in the 1930s, right? This relationship to water that's both kind of dangerous and formative. And so, again, I think the South just brings something out of you. I think the South really does encourage you to kind of look outwardly and inwardly simultaneously, right? And I don't even think the desire to look outward is necessarily desire to get away from the South, but to also like find the South, right? Like where are my people? Where are the other people who understand what I'm going through? Other people who have the same kind of critique and recognition, right? Of the fucked upness of U.S. empire and anti-Blackness. So yeah.
I love that. Kelsey, do you have anything you want to add? Do you have any other questions?
No, I'm just listening. It's been a great conversation.
Yeah. I love it. Okay, so we're actually gonna wrap up because you're about to give your public talk in a few minutes. Yeah, we're gonna try to give you some downtime. So thank you so much for being with us, Randy, and thank all of y'all for coming in and having this conversation with us for Electric Marronage. We're really thinking about like Black femme freedom and fugitivity, right? And this is a perfect way to engage that. So thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.